There are so many interesting books to read in psychology. This one, the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association, APA, is an unusual one to choose to begin this talk. It's full of intricate advice about how to array data in tables, how to reference other publications, and how many decimal places to use when you report statistics. Students come to psychology with rich and varied interests in ordinary and extraordinary people, and conducting psychological research can be a genuinely perspective-changing experience. But the publication manual doesn't necessarily tell you to write about those things in great depth. Instead, it urges a style of writing that aims to be value neutral by being objective, by reporting just the facts without a slant or interpretation. As a consequence, it teaches psychologists and their students that to succeed in publishing, you need to master a style that is, on the face of it, very boring, because there's very little psychology in it at all. My name is Peter Hegarty. I joined the Open University School of Psychology and Counselling in 2020, and here I co-direct the Open Psychology Research Centre that is being launched this week. As a social psychologist, I value research that finds social dynamics in surprising contexts. As a historian of psychology, I write about the cultures of psychological research as social contexts that determine the psychology of psychologists. As an LGBT plus psychologist, I adopt an insider and an outsider's perspectives on these cultures, mindful that they enable my existence as an academic, but are historically configured to undo core aspects of my own and others' psychologies all the same. When I look at the publication manual, I see more than advice about how to write a list of references. I see social norms for communication, with a history, that aim to bind the people in a diverse and literate culture together, in which there's always a risk of treating some people as the other. Indeed, the manual urges us to manage two competing norms as we write. One is the norm to write about people with objectivity, taking a lead from the natural sciences. And the other is to write about people with sensitivity, following the aspiration for psychology to be a humanistic endeavour that recognises and empowers diverse people. The first codes for writing in a particular scientific style for psychology were published in the 1920s. And the first publication manual of the American Psychological Association was published in 1952. In the 1970s, feminist reform urged authors away from using male-centred language to write about other people. As a psychology student in Ireland in the 1980s, I learned the advice current then to talk about the people in my studies as research subjects. And then later, as a PhD student in California in the 1990s, I absorbed the new advice to talk about them as if they were more engaged research participants. Between the 6th edition of the manual, published in 2009, and the 7th edition from 2020, which I have here, advice changed on the recognition of gender and sex of research participants, allowing greater recognition of transgender and non-binary people. So the manual is a fascinating X-ray into the changing norms by which psychologists have been led to manage being both objective scientists and sensitive humanists when we write about the people whom we research. This talk is about the way in which that recognition still falls down in an uneven way along familiar lines of race, ethnicity, culture, gender, and sexuality. To research this unevenness, my colleagues and I have been conducting content analyses of the published content of psychological articles and conducting controlled experiments about how people think about social groups when they reason about them. Three questions that we have often asked in this research are: how do people make sense of group differences when they are reported or when they emerge in research? How do psychologists and lay people consider the generalizability of findings? And how do psychologists and lay people graph and tabulate findings? Three questions that we have asked in this context are: how do lay people and psychologists explain group differences? How do lay people and psychologists generalize findings between groups? And how do lay people and psychologists visualize group differences in graphs and tables? On the first of these 3 points, a question we have often asked is, When group differences are observed, in which group does the cause of that difference seem to lie? About 15 years ago, Carmen Buechel and I sampled one issue in each year of each of 4 leading psychology journals from 1965 to 2004. 388 of the 1,859 articles, about 1 in 5, included gender difference findings. Psychology articles have a standard format consisting of 4 main sections: the introduction of the research question, description of the study method, report of the results, and discussion of their implications. The last 2 sections, results and discussion, are where the gender differences were reported and interpreted. We counted statements in these sections of each article that attribute that gender difference to a particular gender group. Throughout this talk, I'll be talking about that group as the effect to be explained. For instance, if a developmental psychologist had written, "Boys were significantly more overtly aggressive than girls," then we coded that as framing boys as the effect to be explained and girls as the background norm for comparison. If the same difference were framed differently as girls were significantly less overtly aggressive than boys, we would have coded that as framing girls as the effect to be explained. Same difference, different framing, and boys as the background norm for comparison this time. Across the article as a whole, psychologists framed girls and women somewhat significantly more often than boys and men as the effect to be explained. This pattern was consistent across the 40 years were sampled, and within the 388 articles, regardless of whether their first author was a woman or a man. Feminism informed psychology in many ways over this period, including reforming language in the APA publication manual. However, gender differences remained attributed disproportionately to women and girls, whilst the psychology of men and boys rested as its unstated standard of comparison.
Earlier researchers had observed similar effects. Indeed, social psychologist Dale Miller and his colleagues in the early 1990s had asked study participants to explain gender differences in voting behaviour and illness rates in their own words. And here, both women and men wrote explanations that positioned women rather than men as the effect to be explained, sometimes by a ratio of as much as 5:1. In similar controlled experiments that I conducted as part of my own PhD, participants, who were mostly straight, wrote explanations in their own words as to why gay and straight men or lesbian and straight women might recall different childhood experiences. Explanations positioned lesbians and gay men as the effect to be explained here in about 75% of the explanation content, and straight people in only about 25% of it. Finally, social psychologist Felicia Prato and I conducted 4 experiments in which mostly white student participants explained differences between European Americans and African Americans with regard to such matters as trust in the police, medical responses to a blood pressure medication, success in a drug rehab program, and giving money to charity. Across all 4 domains, about 75% of the explanation content focused on how African Americans were the cause of the difference, while only 25% of it focused on how European Americans were the cause of the difference. Now, in all of these experiments, researchers randomly assigned participants to conditions in which one gender, sexuality, or race ethnicity group was described as doing more versus less of the given of the behaviour. And the tendency to take the lower status groups as the effect to be explained was consistent, even when the experiments were tightly controlled in this way.
This evidence of 40 years of asymmetric gender explanations in published psychological science articles is relevant to that dilemma between writing about people with objectivity and writing about people with sensitivity that I mentioned earlier. And I'm not the first to say that there is a relationship between identity and the politics of psychological science. When we wrote up that paper, Carmen Buechel and I used the term Androcentrism to conceptualize the pattern of results that we saw. That term, Androcentrism, was defined earlier by social psychologist Sandra Bem to refer to habits of thought in which men were taken as the norm, women were consequently described primarily in terms of their difference from men, and that worked to women's disadvantage. Also, in 1991, the American Psychological Association published the results of a task force that guided authors about how to write up their research in a less heterosexist way. It also included the advice not to write about differences between homosexual and heterosexual populations by taking heterosexual groups as the unquestioned norm, but instead to write about both groups in an even-handed way. Indeed, Sigmund Freud said something very similar about heteronormative explanation in his 1906 essays on the theory of sexuality. Finally, in the domain of race and ethnicity, psychologist Stanley Su has long argued that psychologists tend to approach white people and ethnic minority people in the United States for different reasons. Very often, basic psychological questions are researched first among white people, and only secondarily are people from ethnic minority populations recruited as participants to check if those processes really do generalize to all or not. To put this in the methodological language of psychology, what Stanley Su is saying is that white people are often studied to assess the internal validity of explanations, and ethnic minority people to assess the external validity of explanations. Your identity shouldn't make a difference to psychologists' ontological stakes in what you are doing, but in many cases it can do, and in many cases it has done. Critiques such as these led me to study how scientific reasoning about other people is affected by the taken-for-granted normative status of whiteness. Imagine that a psychologist observes something among people from one ethnic or racial group. Everyone in this group that the psychologist studies has this characteristic. What should the psychologist conclude? Should they generalize their findings very broadly to conclude that the characteristic is something human, or generalize them in a more narrow way to just that group? Philosophically, there is no absolute right answer to this question, but I wanted to see if, psychologically, the taken-for-granted normative status of whiteness might impact how people manage it. To model scientific reasoning in such a context, I developed a celebrity guessing game. At the start of the game, student participants were presented with the names of either 3 famous white or 3 famous black film stars. Participants were told that all 3 of the named celebrities conformed to a rule that the experimenter held in mind. They were told that their task was to guess what that rule might be. On each turn of the game, participants guessed what the rule was and wrote down the name of another celebrity. Then the experimenter gave them feedback as to whether they had guessed the rule correctly or not, and whether the person they had named fit the rule or not. If the participant hadn't found the experimenter's rule in 20 minutes, or made 15 unsuccessful guesses, then that participant was said to have failed. On the other hand, if the participant successfully guessed the rule before either of these 2 things happened, then they were said to have succeeded. Cognitive psychologists might notice that the game was modeled on the 2-4-6 induction task developed by Peter Hegarty in 1960, a well-researched method of modeling how scientists generate and test hypotheses. The experimenter held one of 2 types of rule in mind: race general rules and race specific rules. Participants in the race general conditions just had to guess that all of the celebrities were actors to succeed. In the race-specific conditions, the participants had to guess a rule that mentioned the celebrity's common race or ethnicity. In the race-general conditions, most participants succeeded in the game, whether they started out with the names of black or white film stars. In other words, it was easy to figure out that either group of 3 actors were all actors. In the race-specific conditions, most participants also succeeded in the black celebrities conditions. However, only about a quarter of participants succeeded in the white celebrities conditions. In other words, it was easy to discover that 3 black film stars were black, but much harder to discover that 3 white film stars were white. We replicated this difficult condition, in which people had to discover that all of the white people were white, in 2 further experiments. Pooling the results of all 3 studied allowed me to draw 2 further conclusions. First, BAME and white students were equally likely to fail to discover the rule that all of the white celebrities were white. White students performed worse, but the difference was not statistically significant. Second, some participants spontaneously generated the name of a celebrity that was not white. When they did, then the experimenter gave them the appropriate feedback that this celebrity did not fit their rule. Such participants were statistically more likely to succeed than those participants who only generated the names of white celebrities when playing the game in this condition. I asked you earlier to imagine a context in which a psychologist knows something is true of everyone they have observed within one group. And this is the situation that participants were in at the start of the celebrity guessing game. The experiment's results suggest that if your starting point is white people, as is very often the case in psychological research, that you are unlikely to figure out that something is a rule for white people only, and that you would more likely generate a rule that it is true of people in general. The whiteness of the white celebrities was noticed by less than half of the participants across the 3 experiments. Participants were most likely to discover the rule that white people are white when they first brought a non-white celebrity to mind. People seemed to need to notice the race of people who are ethnic minority before they noticed that white people have a race.
This tendency to be selectively colourblind about the race of white people is not confined to reasoning in experiments. José Cosadias and his colleagues have drawn attention to what they call a cultural attribution bias. In a sample of published psychological articles, they found that people from racial ethnic minority groups in the US were overrepresented in psychological studies that were about race, culture, and ethnicity, relative to their proportion in the United States population. However, white people were found to be overrepresented in psychological studies of everything else other than race, culture, and ethnicity, relative to their representation in the USA population. In a controlled experiment, Cosadias and his colleagues had academic psychologists evaluate the suitability of a research proposal to study one of several topics. And this proposal suggested that the sample should either be of a minority group or of white people. The psychologists in this experiment reported preferring a study of culture that sampled minority participants, but they preferred a study that was not about culture when it was proposed as approaching its topic via a sample of white people. Psychologists' own ethnicity didn't make a difference to their preferences in this experiment. Both my own and Cosadias' research point to conceptual failures to consider white people as having race, culture, or ethnicity in ways that matter, whilst these are the most prominent things that psychologists emphasize when minority groups are sampled.
At this point, some people might think that I have definitely described something in psychology that is a real problem. Other people might be a bit more slow to draw that conclusion. I'm not saying that it's inherently bad to be seen as a member of a group rather than as a unique individual. Of course, when a group is being marginalized, silenced, then it is vitally important to assert that group identity, to make the group visible. And this is a really important social change strategy to prioritize. In fact, the history of psychology is full of examples of groups who have pursued that strategy and prioritized it, and as a result have been able to achieve greater empowerment. However, holding those thoughts about the complex intergroup dynamics of social dominance and social identity for a moment, there is evidence that having your group chronically positioned as the effect to be explained may limit its empowerment and may limit the extent to which your group can challenge status quo.
Social psychologist Susanna Bruckmüller has conducted multiple experiments showing that the mere framing of group differences as being about one group rather than another communicates something about the groups so described. Participants in her studies have read explanations of differences between law and engineering students, imaginary groups, women and men in leadership positions. In other studies, they wrote explanations of differences between left and right-handed people, or of single and coupled people. I've replicated her procedure recently in regard to reading explanations of differences between same and mixed gender couples. Across measures and group identities, her research consistently shows that when people read or write explanations, that the group positioned as the effect to be explained is perceived as less powerful, less agentic, and sometimes of being of lesser value. So while it is clearly true that in contexts that denies their or our existence, that silenced minority groups can, do, and must assert their group voices to be heard. In the fortunate situations where this empowerment strategy starts to work, it creates a new context with a new problem. The problem of giving voice to complexity and difference and full individuality. And in this new context, you are still the lower power group, even if you are better recognized than before. And the higher power group still has entrenched habits of reasoning about you, first and foremost, in terms of your fascinating difference from them. This relationship between explanation and power can be seen in everyday contexts. There are questions that people ask of individuals in some social groups that cannot easily be returned symmetrically. So, for example, left-handed people are obviously treated much better than they were at earlier points in history, but are still annoyed when someone takes the floor of a conversation to announce, "Oh, you are left-handed." And you can't make the same interruption about a person's right-handedness when it is already assumed. BAME people in the UK often dread the question, "Where are you from?" from white people, particularly if a white person follows up with the question, "No, where are you really from?" that rejects the adequacy of the answer that the BAME person is from London, Glasgow, Swansea, or somewhere else. White people who live in Britain do not have their national identities put under scrutiny in the same sort of way, even those of us who are not British at all. Finally, a married person may just about say warmly to a single friend, "How is someone like you still single?" But the single person may feel singled out by the question and cannot politely reply, "And how is someone like you still married?"
Many years ago, when I first came out, I was always really bothered by the question, how or when did you truly know you were gay? And I felt that asked me to explain something that was inexplicable, or that was, at very best, an answer to a question that was a work in progress in my own psychological relationship to myself at the time. And returning the question by saying, "Aha, and how did you really know you were straight?" only sometimes worked to deflect it away. As an early career researcher in the United States in the 1990s, there were also moments where somebody would seize the floor or change the topic of the conversation to draw attention to my national identity, often via my accent, in a way that was really surprising. "Wait, are you Irish?" And then the follow-up question, "What do you think about," or "What do Irish people think about?" As if those questions were pretty much the same. And then it could really be just about anything. U2, divorce, the Catholic Church, the Good Friday Agreement, what the Pope thinks about Sinead O'Connor, Riverdance, anything that was sort of Irish and sort of globally visible in the 1990s could be the end of that question. You've probably had that experience yourself. I don't think I'm special. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'd have to recognize that we've probably been the people who've created that context for other people in certain kinds of contexts, that we've made other people feel like the effect to be explained as well. And when I pick up kids' books, I always think, this must be how xylophones feel when they're taken out of the cupboard, not to hear the gorgeous timbres that they can produce, but once again, disappointingly, just to illustrate that the letter X really can stand for something. Now, if we can empathize with these experiences, can we understand that they bear a resemblance to the position that many people are placed in their social interactions with the psychologists who research them? People are often approached by psychologists primarily because they're interested in those people representing a group that hasn't been very well represented so far. They're often demanded to answer questions that are not of their own choosing, and in contexts that they wouldn't choose to be questioned in. The APA publication manual forbids a lot of things from our scientific discourse. So, for example, it tells you that you shouldn't report your statistics to 3 decimal places very often. But it doesn't exclude this. And if I could experience this, and we can all experience this, informal culture of asymmetric demand to be explained, and you can even experience it in the corridors of psychology conferences, when there is nothing to forbid it happening, why would it not skitter across and start to populate the more formal accounts that we have of group differences that we call objective and value neutral science?
To consider what might happen if such advice were to be concluded, I want to return to this paper with which I started the talk. It contains a second finding that I haven't discussed yet. In addition to coding verbal explanations for their focus of attention, we also examined the graphs and tables of gender differences in the 282 papers where they appeared. In about 3/4 of cases, the data were graphed or tabulated with men or boys first, meaning on the left or on the top of the figure, and with women and girls second, on the right or on the bottom of the figure. This preference to put men and boys first was evident throughout papers published from 1965 to 2004, and regardless of the gender of the paper's first author. With Tony Lemieux and Grant McQueen, I then conducted several experiments in which people drew, remembered, or interpreted graphs of gender differences and other group differences. These experiments showed us that the preference to graph men first is robust, and it occurs because of the stereotype that men are more powerful and women the weaker sex. Still, it was a surprise to me when the 2009 edition of the APA Publication Manual cited the 2006 paper by Hegarty and Buechel as grounds for the manual's advice to authors to consider the effects of stereotypes on their thinking when they graphed and tabulated gender and race differences. Now, 10 years on from the 2009 Publication Manual, it's possible to see if graphing practices have changed in response to its advice. Amy Power and I are currently asking this question by sampling articles from one issue of each of the top 2 quartiles of journals in 2 subdisciplines of psychology where gender differences are frequently reported. Those areas are developmental psychology and social personality psychology. In this research, we also attended to the first author's gender. Telling patterns are emerging in our data. It seems that in developmental psychology, of those papers that we've sampled, published in 2019, most of the graphs and tables still positioned men and boys first, irrespective of the gender of the article's first author. Not much has changed a decade on from the Publication Manual's advice to think about gender stereotypes when arranging groups in graphs. However, in social personality psychology, a difference by author gender has opened up. Here it seems men authors are more likely to position men first in graphs and tables, and women authors are more likely to position women first. Perhaps this gender difference in the social personality area shows that graph and table order is now an expression of social identity and stereotyping, whereas it was once only an expression of gender stereotyping. In some areas of psychology, such as social and personality psychology, women seem to be breaking the stereotypic conventions of visualizing differences, while men seem to be resisting them. And in other areas of psychology, such as developmental psychology, neither women nor men seem to be changing these conventions very much at all.
I'm going to finish the talk there and turn things over to the question and answer session now. You've heard enough about my thoughts on these kinds of topics, and I'm curious to hear what yours might be. I'm wondering what you think minority groups can hope for from better and more complete representation and recognition by psychology. I'm wondering if I've made you think that maybe some boring books are not so boring after all, because you can find psychology in them, and history and politics. Over the next week, you're going to hear a lot of interesting talks from my qualitative psychology colleagues about ways of being critical that involve moving away from psychology's central culture of experimentation. And I think I'm hopeful that you might listen to those talks and hear their melodies slightly differently framed by virtue of hearing a kind of baseline that I've given you here that suggests that that experimental culture can also be in some ways reflexive and critical of itself. So let's turn things over to you now, because these are definitely the kinds of conversations that I hope we can continue to host and to hold in the Open Psychology Research Centre. Thank you for your time and for your attention.